What is the best weapon for a fantasy character? When determining which weapon is best in a fictional scenario, you first need to understand who the character is and what they're using it for. All of these types of weapon had a specific role in historical warfare, and for any given purpose, some would be better than others. But it's also important to remember that fantasy is not history, and just because something may not have been the best weapon for a particular historical context, doesn't mean that a fantasy character can't make good use of it. Because for fantasy, the stories that these weapons tell can be more important than their actual historical purpose. So, let's have a look at a bunch of these weapons, talk about their pros and cons in history and in fantasy, consider what they mean to a modern audience, and then decide which is best. Swords are great. They can be good for stabbing or slashing. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and their lightweight and slim profile means you can carry them on a belt as a sidearm. But a character on a budget might be better with an axe. And if you're going into a battle, you might also want some more damage or some better range. Now, if you've got the budget, you can solve that by going big. With the right training, a big sword can be impressive and deadly, but it can still be outranged by a much cheaper, pointy stick. And if you want range, then a bow is fantastic until your enemy gets close and you need a backup. Because ultimately, the reason so many weapons were used throughout history is because there is no best weapon. All of these have their own strengths and weaknesses, and deciding what is best for a character means you need to understand who they are, what's going on in their world, what they're using it for, what their limitations are. So when you're planning out a story and you want to find out what the best weapon is going to be, using a tool like World Anvil to track your setting, your towns, your cities, your people, their relationships, and all of that stuff means that you can choose the right setup for your story. Because ultimately, the best weapon for any character is the one that's best for the story. So for starters, let's take a dive into swords. It's probably not an exaggeration to say that these are the most popular fantasy weapon. Whether you're looking at ancient mythology or modern video games, more of the magic items and more of the heroes' weapons are likely to be swords than any other weapon type. But why is that? Swords have been really popular throughout history. As mentioned earlier, they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, and they can be used for both slashing and stabbing. They're also expensive to make, requiring quite a lot of metal for their size when compared with, say, an axe or a spear. And that gives them status. It costs money to make one of these things, and so they were more likely to be wielded by wealthy people and more likely to be considered of significance. They were also more likely, therefore, to be handed down through generations. A good sword wasn't something you just threw away at the end of a battle, it was something you wanted to keep hold of, treasure, and look after. And so heirloom swords make their way into mythology a lot more than, say, axes. This is a pattern that we see in a lot of mythology and fantasy. Historically, most heroes in these kind of stories were of reasonably high status, and so the weapons they wielded, the equipment they had, was meant to display that status and often even exaggerate it. A magic sword proved a king's worth because a regular sword was expensive. This is partly why big swords are so popular. Despite not being used that much throughout history, when they were used, they were impressive, they were expensive, they were more likely to be displayed or used as status symbols, and so they had this wow factor that you just don't really get from a spear. Now, this isn't to say these were just about status. Big swords could be used for controlling areas, blocking off spaces, and generally making sure that people didn't go where you didn't want them to. In other scenarios, they were deployed against pike formations because their mass and their hooks were really good for pushing aside enemy weapons and creating an opening for your mates to rush in. But it's also worth noting that that shock factor was not insignificant. The fact that this is bigger and more expensive than someone else's gear means that the person wielding it probably has access to training and equipment that is beyond them. If you see a big guy running in with one of these, you would want to be pretty confident in the discipline and the training of the guys around you to know that you'd be able to take him, because otherwise you're going down. And that confidence and morale is a huge part of winning or losing a fight. And it's one of the reasons that these were so popular in history and why they've retained that kind of impact moving into fantasy. Now, smaller swords, being much easier to carry, didn't fulfill that same role. They were much more likely to be your backup weapon that you used after getting in close when your other larger spear or whatever wasn't suitable anymore. They were also much more suitable for general civilian carry. As a self-defense tool, something like this doesn't require too much space between you and the enemy to be able to draw, and it also means you can still walk through doorways and eat and do things like that without it being an inconvenience. And that made swords an incredibly popular sidearm for anyone who could afford them. They could be carried in the street, so increasingly elaborate designs displayed status, and they could be used in duels, which paves the way for swashbuckling heroes and characters like that. A sword may not be as specialised as an axe or a hammer, and it may not have the reach of a polearm or a spear, but its ease of carry makes it an excellent companion for a travelling adventurer. It can be easily drawn and wielded on the go, and it retains this image of a heroic weapon even today, allowing you to make your heroes look like heroes just by wielding one. But swords aren't for everyone, and especially in times and places where metal wasn't all that common, they were also pretty rare. But if you can't get hold of a sword, there's a pretty good chance you can wield one of these. Axes were also an incredibly popular sidearm throughout history. It doesn't take much to keep one of these in your belt while you're wielding a larger weapon and then draw it out when you need it. But compared with a sword, the fact that the handle's made of wood and you only have a small amount of relatively solid metal in the head means that they were easier to maintain and less expensive to produce. But this isn't to say they were just unrefined brute force weapons. Historical axes made for war were a lot thinner and therefore lighter and faster than axes that are designed as tools. Although there were also cases where something that's in between could be useful as both a tool and a weapon. They were often made with a shape that was good for both slashing and hooking. And while they weren't specialised stabbing weapons, a thrust with an axe is still going to cause you a sad time. The interesting thing for me is that the common fantasy is of these as brute weapons, moved slowly for big, powerful hits. But in real life, these were actually kind of difficult to use. You've got to be pretty precise with your strike to make sure that you hit with a relatively narrow blade compared with the full-length blade of a sword. You also don't have very much defense for your knuckles, so when you're parrying or blocking, you need to be incredibly careful about where you place that, often using maneuvers that push enemy weapons out of the way before retaliating, or even using the hilt to block an attack and force your axe into your opponent's face. In many ways, these were just as much a finesse weapon as a sword was, and high-status warriors wielding big axes like the Huskarls fulfilled a very similar role to the bodyguards wielding giant swords. Unfortunately, because a modern audience is much more used to the weight and speed of a woodcutting axe, some of the finesse and skill involved in a combat axe has been lost to modern perception. But for a fantasy character who wants to wield a weapon that inflicts very scary wounds, or for a character that's from a more down-to-earth, grounded background and wants to use them wandering through the woods, I still think an axe is an excellent choice of backup, and I would really like to see more of them in the hands of ranger characters, rather than the standard knives and daggers. Now, the axe's angrier sister is the hammer. Like an axe, they mostly are made of wood and use a relatively small amount of metal at the top. Although, depending on the hammer, this might still be a heck of a lump. It doesn't take anywhere near as much finesse to make as something like a sword. Also like the axe, they evolved from tools, with the tool version being a lot heavier and slower than the ones used as weapons. Although in a pinch, something like this might still serve as a breaching tool. This has also led to a slight difference in the way they're perceived in fantasy. And while the axe is generally considered a tool to show off someone's brutality, a hammer is generally a sign that they are incredibly strong, often wielding things with a mass that would be greater than their own body. In real life, of course, this doesn't hold up. Even if you had super strength, wielding something that's heavier than you is going to result in you moving around the weapon rather than the weapon moving around you. But once again, it neglects some of the finesse that existed in the real versions of these weapons. This could be carried once again as a backup. You could have it alongside a shield, and you could use it relatively quickly with the option of turning it around and getting especially brutal. The hammerhead was particularly good for hitting opponents in armor, because you don't have to get through it to ring the bell, create a dent, and stun them for a couple of seconds so that you can close in with your dagger or your pick and finish them off. So in real life, the fantasy stereotype of blunt equals subduing damage kind of falls down, and these were just as brutal, if not more so, than axes. A character that wields one of these as a sidearm instead of a sword is probably doing so because they care more about damage than they do about status and finesse. They're probably that little bit stronger, that little bit angrier, and they really don't like people in armor. They're a particularly good backup weapon for a strong archer who uses heavy longbows because they have the power in their shoulders to swing it down while not necessarily having the melee training to be able to go toe-to-toe with an opponent with a light sword. This thing both fascinates and terrifies me, and while I wouldn't necessarily want to use one myself, there's definitely a place for them for an interesting fantasy character. And now we come to the broadest category in this video, polearms. A polearm is basically any long stick-based weapon, and there's a version of every other weapon type I've talked about and more covered in this category. The quintessential polearm is probably a spear, because all you need is a stick and a way to make it pointy, and you've got one of these. They are probably one of the oldest weapons after the regular blunt hitty stick, and are used even today in modern warfare in the form of bayonets and things like that that make a pre-existing stick into a pointy one. Spears are an incredibly versatile weapon. They can be used as long pokey sticks to keep people at bay, choked up and used in close quarters like a staff, one-handed with a shield. They can be thrown, they can be anti-cavalry, they can be used from cavalry, they can clear space, or be used in a one-on-one duel at both long and short range. And the vast majority of other polearms that exist are basically a spear that has been specialized for another purpose. Some prioritize slashing damage, some are longer and better at stabbing, some are heavier and better at hitting, some are designed for holding space better, some are designed to be better in a duel, some are better for catching people, some deal bludgeoning damage and are less lethal, some are more lethal. But by taking the bit that you like about this and amplifying it, you can create a weapon for basically any purpose. But despite all that versatility, polearms, and especially spears, are much rarer in fantasy than they were in history. Part of that is probably because they were cheap and common. In a huge number of armies throughout history, the spear was the standard infantry weapon that everybody used. And so making myths and legends about them feels a bit unexciting to most people. There's also the fact that the myths and legends were often made and propagated by people of relatively high status, whereas a polearm could be a pretty cheap thing that you already had on your farm. But spears and polearms are fantastic weapons for fantasy characters. Because of their versatility, a character who's got one of these as part of their kit will never really have to switch it out depending on the circumstance. They can just change to use a different technique, which can be very visually impressive. They also have a hugely important historical role in fighting monsters. Almost any time someone in history wanted to fight and kill something that was bigger than them, they took a pointy stick and they prodded it from a distance until it fell. So forget your massive monster hunting greatswords and hammers. A true monster hunter wields a polearm. But if you really want to take out something bigger and stronger than you, you need a ranged weapon. And no Bloomineck video would be complete without mentioning my favorite weapon, the bow. Like spears, bows have been around for a really, really long time. They've been invented separately on almost every continent that humans have inhabited, and their basic premise, although it's gone through loads of different iterations, remains basically the same. They're a way of launching pointy sticks by amplifying your own muscle power to kill things that are a long way off. Bows are fairly frequently represented in modern media, and because they have a pretty clear link to hunting, the characters that use them often embody the qualities of the hunter. They're stealthy, they spend time outdoors, they're good at tracking, they often have animal companions, they tend to go with just a knife and relatively small amount of equipment and travel over long distances, and they're patient and they wait to snipe their targets. But their association with cunning, guile, and craftiness has also created a different stereotype of archers. That of rapid, agile shooters who delight in attacking from unusual positions and are generally pretty fast on their feet. This split between archers as hunters and archers as show-offs can be found as far back as ancient Greek mythology, with Artemis and Apollo, the twin gods of archery, being also the gods of hunting, and of performances, respectively. But in prioritizing the cunning and agility of archers, something has been lost. In modern stereotypes and modern fantasy, archers are almost always agility or dexterity-based warriors. Their attacks deal relatively low damage and are high speed. Or they're slow and do low damage, but they still run off an agile physical stat. Whereas in real life, if you want a bow to deal more damage, it needs to have more weight. The more powerful a bow is, the stronger the person that wields it needs to be. This has a 60-pound draw. So when I'm shooting at relatively high speeds, I'm pulling that weight back for every single shot. And that takes energy. Historical war bows, which had draw weights sometimes of between 100 and 180 pounds, could take years of training to even draw back, never mind shoot effectively. I don't have those years of training, I'm out of practice. This is beyond me at the moment. Even somebody who's naturally pretty strong and athletic would struggle with a bow like this unless they've specifically trained their body for it for a long period of time. The interesting thing is, this used to be more well known. In ancient mythology, characters like Heracles, who were known for their strength, were also known for being really good with a powerful bow. Odysseus, despite primarily being known for his cunning, was able to display his strength by stringing a bow that nobody else could. But as the use of heavier bows falls further and further into the past, and modern target bows not only don't need that weight, but are actively hampered by being harder to use, that perception of archers as strong has faded away, and the idea that they are skinny, scrawny, agile characters has taken over. And look, I love me a dexterous guile archer. I really like the archetype of the rogue archer and the ranger archer, but I think we're missing something by losing out on the strength required for that. I think meeting in the middle between axes requiring some finesse and bows requiring some strength would allow for a really interesting archetype of a woodsman hunter character who uses axes and bows. Much like Connor in Assassin's Creed 3. And look, I mentioned bows, so I need to talk about crossbows. Crossbows fulfilled a similar but different role in combat. They were harder to make, more expensive to produce, and way easier to learn to use effectively. While a heavy warbow could take years of training to get strong enough to pull back, a heavy crossbow could use a crank or leverage to be able to get a much higher draw for much less effort. Meaning that you could take a group of relatively untrained soldiers and have them equipped and effectively wielding crossbows in a relatively short space of time. They had a really interesting historical niche, in Europe at least, in that they were a more expensive weapon, but a weapon that was more likely to be wielded by untrained soldiers. In other parts of the world, that wasn't necessarily true, and fancy siege crossbows and repeating crossbows developed in Asia fulfilled different roles in their battlefield. But even if your crossbow is repeating, the amount of power you can get into it from this position is not going to be as much as you can get into a bow by using your entire body weight for the same amount of speed. So a bow was always still the weapon of somebody that wanted to do more damage on a more regular basis, while a crossbow was a more accessible tool for somebody that wanted something that they could use more easily, which isn't to say that crossbows were only used by people that didn't have extreme training. Highly trained and skilled crossbowmen developed complex tactics that involved the use of moving shields to exploit the fact that you don't need to be aiming at your target while you draw this back, so that you could stay safe and then pop around ready for your shot. But the fictional version of crossbows bears very little resemblance to their real historical role because of one thing: guns. Almost any time you see a crossbow in fiction, it is being used as a visual analogue for a gun. They will be used and held in the same way that guns are. They might be used crossbows akimbo, and they're generally rapid firing, especially when compared with the real-life versions, which could frequently take the best part of a minute to reload. Now, while this stereotype doesn't really hold up, this isn't to say that the more realistic version doesn't hold a place in fantasy. A realistic crossbowman fulfills more of a role of a sniper, who can shoot from relatively hidden positions, compared with an archer who needs more space for the limbs of their bow. They're going to be less out in the open, and they can spend more time waiting with the whole thing cocked and drawn for the moment to shoot. But if you really want to lean more into the firearm trope and make them more like a modern weapon, then they can also be wielded by a character who's crafty, good at inventing, or in a more steampunk setting, to make a crossbow, which can be used relatively rapidly to put a sequence of bolts into a target at moderately high power, effectively replacing the niche of a regular bow with something that can be held more like this. And look, there are many other weapons like slings, flails, meteor hammers and the like which I haven't covered here and are still incredibly cool. And mostly, I just don't own one. But between swords, axes, hammers, polearms, bows and crossbows, I feel like we've got a pretty good selection of heroic weapons. So let's rank them. Okay, this has turned out to be way harder than I thought it would be. I kind of love all of these weapons and I don't actually hate any of them. But I said I would come up with the best, so here's my ranking. At the bottom tier of these things, which isn't to say they're bad, is crossbows and hammers. Both of these fulfill important roles in historical weapon use, but they're both a little bit niche when it comes to a fantasy character. This one being specifically good for getting through armor, and this one being specifically more of a kind of sniper role, because fantasy heroes are unlikely to fulfill the untrained militia stereotype. So it's gonna largely come down to using it a bit like a gun. And to be honest, if you're gonna use something a bit like a gun in a fantasy setting, you may as well just use a gun. They've been around since easily as long as plate armor, much, much longer in Asia. So we have options there to replace it anyway. If we're going fantasy, let's go full fantasy. Next up, I've got swords. I'm being a bit unfair by ranking these and these into the same category because they're very different bits of kit. But swords are incredibly good. They're an incredibly useful tool for a fantasy adventurer, but they're hugely overrated. Any given fantasy setting has dozens of magical swords and so few magical everything else that I really feel like I would like to see more of other things. So this is ranking where it is, not because it's not useful, it is and remained an incredibly useful tool, but I think it is slightly overrepresented and I would like to see more of the other things. Please don't hate me. Next up are bows and axes. I love both of these. They're both a very good weapon for an underdog type character who isn't as wealthy as a sword wielder. So for a Robin Hood style rising up from the ranks, they both have a really good role. You can play up your strength a little bit with an axe or a bow if you want to. And there's an amount of finesse involved in really skilled axe fighting that I would just love to see more of in media. Axes being used in duels were incredibly rare, but in Viking times, training with axes was done to an extent that they clearly would have been very, very good at it, if it came to it. This thing can be thrown, it can be used in melee, it can be held as a backup, so someone could use both of these at the same time. And that, I think, creates a niche for a very fun character. These, meanwhile, are just a very, very good ranged hero weapon. They can be used for rapid shooting, they can be used for long-range shooting, they can be used to emphasize power, they can be used to emphasize speed and agility. They can be used from horseback or on foot and develop very, very different tactics depending on what you do with them. And they're cheap to make, in theory, but they require a high amount of skill to get good with. And I think that's really, really useful for a fantasy character. They can be starting out on their journey and still have something like this, and they can progress and become an incredibly skilled and highly dangerous warrior while still wielding it. But while I absolutely love bows and they continue to be my favorite weapon, they are not, in my opinion, the best weapon for a fantasy character. Because the best weapon for a fantasy character is one of these. Polearms in general and spears in particular just have so much going for them. They can represent that underdog mentality, or they can be fancy and flourished and wielded as something that someone with a lot of prestige has. You can use them in almost any historical setting. They can be used with or without a shield. There are so many different options. And like the bow, they have a low-cost startup, but a very high skill ceiling. You could spend your entire life training with a spear and still not discover everything that it can do. So for someone that is starting out on their adventurer journey, or someone that's been on their adventurer journey for a long time, this is an incredibly useful bit of kit for them to have with them, and they can carry other weapons as well while still using this as their primary. I think there's a lot still to be explored with these, and I would love to see more representation of them in modern Western fantasy media. So that's been my ranking. As always, I will absolutely have missed things, fumbled points, and generally worded things poorly. So if there's extra points you want to make, please drop them down in the comments. If you want to check out more of what I do, my channel is obviously here, but I will put a link down to my link tree below so you can see where I got some of these things from and where I can teach you some stuff about archery. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you very much for coming this far, and I will see you in the next video.